So, once again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. You are very welcome to the Teaching Toolkit Thursday. Today, we are going to talk about giving effective feedback. So, as I mentioned, we are going to have a short presentation, hopefully to give you as much information as you need to think and reflect upon what effective feedback is. And then we're going to have a kind of an open session towards the end, whereby we'll endeavor to answer all of your questions, any queries that you have, and indeed share resources and ideas that people are using and utilizing themselves. So it's an opportunity for you to engage with one another. So a quick overview of exactly what we're going to talk about in this short session. So obviously we want to actually define what feedback is, what it looks like and how it works. And although there are kind of a multiple variations of what people think feedback is, we're going to kind of stick with one particular version of that. We're also going to look at what opportunities there are within our curriculum to provide feedback. And I have a kind of a little subtle way of actually how it is we're going to do that. We're then going to look at a couple of practice models, so different kind of models of how feedback is given, and quickly look at their commonalities and focus on one particular version that we here in UCD try to use and try to kind of integrate. We're then going to kind of pause for a little moment and think about how it is one might design their feedback protocol and considerations therein. And then obviously what we want to do is give you a few examples of how staff give feedback and provide feedback, but also how students can engage in the feedback process. And therein lies a little bit of the kind of catch-22. Students are obviously fundamental to this process. So it's not only about us, as in faculty, giving feedback, it's also about students engaging with that feedback. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up in 15 minutes flat with telling you exactly how and where you can make it most effective for your cohorts. So as I said in the chat, if you have any questions at any time, please put them into the chat and we will come back to them in the end. And don't hesitate to interject if you need to as we move on. So let us begin with a little bit of a definition of feedback. And what we try to do throughout the presentation is capture resources that are available for you. So we will share this slide deck with you afterwards, and indeed the video if you wish to review it. But let us think about what feedback is first. So what we've kind of done here is we've tried to kind of think about it as an open dialogue, one in which each party is engaged, i.e. the student and the faculty member. But obviously, it's around the student's assessment. Now, there's a little asterisk to that I'll come back to momentarily. But what we want the student to be able to do, to be in a position to do, is to engage and reflect on their assessments, on their engagement with the assessment process, and figure out how it is that they can improve, okay? So they want to be able to gather feedback of all kind of manner and kinds so that they can develop their own abilities. And that goes further in terms of actually making sure the students are completely au fait, they are literate with feedback process, and so that they can actually not only use the feedback that we might give them, but engage in a much broader process of feedback to figure out themselves how it is they are progressing, what their particular learning needs might be, and more importantly, how to address those. So it is a kind of a two-way process, an open dialogue. Now, the reason why I have a little asterisk over the assessment is this is assuming one's assessment is designed effectively and appropriately. And what I simply mean by that is that hopefully all of our assessments are aligned to a module's outcomes, i.e. what that simply means is that the assessment is pertinent, relevant to the attainment, the demonstration of achievement of the said outcomes of a module. So thus they are kind of interlinked, they are aligned along a continuum. So everything a student does is always towards the attainment or achievement of that said module outcome. And we will come back to that in another teaching toolkit, perhaps in more detail. So what are those opportunities I spoke of? So many of us engage in formative assessment. Perhaps we don't know that we do, but we do. Sometimes it's a discussion in class, it's an opportunity to engage the students with one another, where they tease out things. This is different modes of formative assessment. It may well be that we offer our students a diagnostic, an opportunity to engage with a MCQ or a draft essay, and we give them feedback or indeed feed forward as to how to improve that. So again, this is another form of formative assessment. And what we have here in this example are two processes of formative assessment. Assessment as learning, where students are actually engaged in an activity like that discussion, like an in-class poster or a kind of, a discussion kind of trying to kind of hierarchy of different kind of elements or tease out different lab processes. And then there's assessment for learning, where they're given feedback on perhaps draft iterations or diagnostic opportunities. And these opportunities, as I say, are manifold. So assessment isn't just about the summative, where they're getting feedback on something that they've done and dusted. The idea of formative assessment and consequently formative feedback is that student has that opportunity to engage with the process and improve. So consequently, formative assessment is the most important opportunity, if you like, for students to engage with the feedback process, and for us to enable students to better their learning, to figure out where it is they're going and how to improve and match or attain those objectives and outcomes for the module. So, different models. What you will note from the three examples here, so what we have is one from Newcastle University, one from a Scottish education project, and then Wigan's piece that we ourselves kind of integrate in our work here in UCD, or try to. And what you will notice from across all of them are a couple of commonalities. There's this piece about, engagement, there's a piece about communication, there's a piece about reflection, there's a piece about, being able to recognize what feedback is. This notion of user-friendly, so that not only is it friendly to you and I in terms of how it is we give our feedback, but the actual kind of literacy around that process is clear. So the students know what they're giving feedback on, whether that's criteria for a particular assignment, mapped to those learning outcomes that I mentioned, whether it's actually going to be constructive and enable them to reflect and develop on a particular kind of assessment piece, formative or otherwise. But most importantly, that it's actually a continuum, that there's, again, going back to that open dialogue, that there is a iterative phase in this, that students can engage in multiple times, multiple perspectives on a particular assignment or a particular piece of work. And the other thing in terms of making it actually effective to mention is that feedback needs to be actionable. And what we mean by this is, if we give guidance about how to improve something, we give constructive guidance. We say, look to the set criteria that we have for writing an essay, provide, specific references to address or develop. And again, all of this will depend on the level of your cohort, the particular assignment you've devised, and indeed the formative opportunities of that assignment. So if it's preparing for an essay and there's a discussion in class, that's almost the preemptive piece. But the discussion needs to be structured. So what are the key readings that one might engage with? What are we looking for from said readings? What are the criteria that might be mapped to that? And how do we interrelate that into writing up the argument or the debate about how that impacts the particular theme or topic at hand? So all of this, what you can see, hopefully, is that the feedback isn't just done in isolation. It's done very much as part of the assessment process. And more importantly, part of the formative assessment process that we can actually devise and put in place. So let's have a look at how one might design that and put that into action. So one of the things that comes out of the literature and the research around this is to make certain that there are opportunities for the students to become wholly engaged in the feedback process. So I put in the kind of concept of co-creation. And what this simply means is that it opens up the dialogue around what feedback is, what assessment criteria might be, but it gives students an opportunity to articulate what their understandings are of a given topic or a given theme. So if we have criteria around, and again, I'll use an essay, or we have a set of multiple choice questions that are testing one's knowledge on a particular application, having the discussion around what those criteria are, what kinds of questions one might ask, is really important. And if you think about it, that discussion might simply be hands raised in a a given session to kind of get people thinking about it before they engage in it. It might go further and actually enable the students to say, well, actually, what I really want to be able to focus on is how to reference literature, or how to, write my lab journal, or how to kind of capture a fieldwork study. And so there are things that learners will say that they are after. And 9 times out of 10, what they're after are actually immediately pertinent to the given module. And what we're simply doing is opening up that opportunity for students to engage and say, well, actually, yes, that is exactly what I want to do. That's what I want to focus on. And thus, this is the feedback I might like to help me do that. And I would say that, as I say, 9 times out of 10, that isn't going to move far away from what it is we are going to do anyway with said assignments. The other piece that comes in hand with that is actually making sure that you and I, as faculty, and indeed the students, are aware exactly of how the feedback is going to be delivered, whether that's online, whether that's through the results of an MCQ, whether it's actually a video piece that one can do in Brightspace, for example, or an audio piece back, where the students will actually find it, when it will be delivered. And obviously we have regulations in UCD about how soon feedback ought to be delivered to individuals and indeed to plenary groups. And most importantly, how one engages with that feedback. So I suppose one of the big dilemmas that you and I have is we perhaps spend a lot of time giving constructive feedback, or try to, and we realize students, A, haven't found it, B, didn't know it was there, and C, don't know what to do with it. So consequently, there's a communication piece, there's a literacy piece to actually explain, this is when you'll get it, this is where you'll find it, and this is what you can expect, how it might help and how it might prepare you for the next piece moving forward. Again, all the time to engage and develop that learner's opportunities to improve their assignment. So let's have a quick look at a couple of methodologies. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with these. Individual feedback after an assessment. So what perhaps you need to kind of note here is that obviously there's the opportunity of giving feedback individually or collectively after a formative assessment. So again, whether that's a diagnostic test, an assignment, an activity in class, don't lose those opportunities of providing constructive feedback to help the learners kind of progress from where they're at. There's the plenary piece that I mentioned, kind of a classroom piece of feedback, so rather than an individual. So again, going back to the regulations, 28 days, and giving everyone individual feedback is sometimes a huge workload. But we can get around that by giving plenary feedback, saying these are the key findings, this is what you need to do, these are the things I've noticed. It might not apply to everyone, but these are the generic issues arising. And that meets the regulations, but it also helps as an immediate piece if we can give that back perhaps in class rather than sending it out as an announcement on Brightspace or elsewhere. Obviously, in terms of the feedback individually, vis-a-vis an activity, I mean, this is really kind of, opportunistic. And again, whether we can do this in large classes is perhaps a little bit difficult to say, but there are opportunities to actually give those, moments in a class individually, collectively. Indeed, think about activities that we might do. If there are kind of, divide our class into groups, the groups give us information back, we can respond to those groups rather than to individuals, but nonetheless are touching each group and each individual's kind of needs as they emerge from that. So there are lots of opportunities there coming out of activities, formative activities that might happen in class. And then the other one, of course, is the online feedback. So interesting enough, in Brightspace, I mentioned the video opportunity, audio opportunity. If we use quizzes, then we can actually put in feedback options and indeed prompts if people get questions wrong. But there's also an opportunity to actually embed rubrics within Brightspace. And that enables a student perhaps to self-assess and actually to self-review and thus provide them with constructive process of how it is they might develop something. And in fact, the rubric can actually be released in advance of an assignment or an activity. So students can, review before they even submit, which is a wonderful opportunity in progressing one's development on a piece of work. Now, the other piece that we mentioned are some opportunities of student-generated feedback. And And this is kind of an interesting piece that people often kind of overlook. So sometimes, and I've already kind of alluded to one of these in terms of the rubric, but a checklist is a similar kind of piece. And again, there are checklist tools within Brightspace, but it enables the students to kind of go through to figure out what it is they should have done, how well they should have done it, and it allows them to kind of prep in advance for what comes next, which is really kind of useful in terms of engaging the feedback process. The other thing to mention, as I mentioned, the feedback methods from student side, is that oftentimes many students don't realize that the process they're engaging in is actually a form of feedback. And I think you and I need to be very kind of articulate and say, as part of the literacy piece, that here is a feedback opportunity when you engage with the checklist, when you engage with self-assessment questions, inviting you to reflect and develop kind of pieces of their work, whether it's via a rubric or some open questions. These are feedback opportunities. And in fact, they're feed forward because the students are immediately engaging with them and they can see and answer the questions, and it should trigger opportunities for themselves to develop. The other piece, if you kind of move up a little bit in terms of scale and activity, is actually to use the students themselves to support one another. So peer marking. And we have a tool in UCD called Peer Scholar, which one can actually integrate into Brightspace. And it will actually do it anonymously. We can put rubrics into there. We can ask students to, support one another. What I will say about this is that it does take time to integrate, not only from our perspective and getting used to it, but also from the learners. If they haven't actually had the opportunity to peer review one another's work, then this is something that they will kind of look at and develop over time. And in fact, it's one of those things, I'm sure you know, that when you peer review an article for a colleague or kind of even just give a glance of a read, you realize things yourselves about the work, about kind of the writing, about the structure, about the arguments. And I suppose it's a wonderful way of actually upping our skills almost surreptitiously. So the peer marking is a really wonderful opportunity. So obviously it's not something we might integrate at a first year level, but it is definitely something to introduce gently and build up over time, and indeed build the skill set within the student body themselves. And then the final example here is simply student-steered feedback. And this is really just kind of trying to get the students to kind of recognize what it is they've done, but also what it is they're seeking. So I previously mentioned the idea of that learning need. What are the student specific needs in regard to the essay, in regard to the project, in regard to the assessment that they're doing? What is it that they would like to get feedback on? What is it that they wish to develop specifically to enable them to achieve the best possible outcome for this given module or assignment that they're doing? Right, so what and how do we actually give good feedback? So this is from a nice project from a few years ago out of the UK. And I've kind of paraphrased it here slightly because there's a rather nice tone that goes with this. But what we have here are 6 points that are really quite pertinent to all of us. So feedback. It has to clarify exactly what good performance is. So what that simply means to you and I is that if it's an essay, if it's a project, have we the assessment criteria worked out? What is it that we want from that project? Is it clear? Is it kind of shareable to our students so that everything is actually going to be pertinent and on point, and thus transparent, not only in terms of what we're giving, but also how the students engage, and more importantly, what they will get back. Encouraging time and effort on particular activities. So that comes back to that student-led feedback, but also making sure that they actually have the opportunity to engage in something that is challenging. Assessment should be hard. It should, get them to kind of, think outside of the box. It should actually get them to think about things in different perspectives, whether that's kind of conceptually or kind of applied. So thus you want students to be able to recognize exactly what they're doing, how they're doing, and what is the best outcome of this. High quality feedback. This is actually simply to make sure that students know exactly what to do with that feedback. So communicating, being literate, giving them direct guidance about how they can improve said grade, said assignment, and so forth. And in hand with that is the opportunity that we need to give them to close the gap in terms of any desired performance. And what that simply means is if a student has identified something, if a student has, received something, that needs enhancement, that we have given them the direction about how to close that gap, how to kind of improve that particular piece, so that it's specific feedback in that instant. Ensuring summative assessment has a positive impact. So this is one of the kind of asides. So what often happens is that the summative assessment is a do or die piece. It's something that's going to be kind of high stakes. So consequently, have we given them opportunity, formative opportunities in advance of that to succeed as best as they can when they come to the summative version? So i.e. building towards a particular, graded summative assessment, have we kind of given them enough opportunity and activities so that they fully understand how best they can actually do that? And by and large, we do that, but it's actually, again, it's making sure that the students know that the activities we're doing are preparing them for a given assessment, a given assignment. And then the other final piece goes back to the very first slide in terms of having the definition. It's about making sure there is an open dialogue, that it's always present. So yes, we may have our specific feedback modalities that we've chosen to use, formative activities, online pieces, but it's not to dissuade the students from still raising a hand or reaching out and kind of developing even further. And I think that's good practice all round, regardless. So what do you need to take home from all of this? So this is closing the feedback loop. So whenever we give feedback, what we want the student be able to do is to make certain they know what to do with that feedback and can actually follow through and enhance. And so then when they come to summative assignment or the next iteration, they have been able to address any instances that require addition, enhancement, and so forth and so on. So closing the feedback loop is essential. But what's most essential is communicating clear goals, having open dialogue all the time, and having multiple opportunities to engage with the learner. So different modalities. The other piece that we obviously need to be very mindful of is the time, hence this big, large tick-tocking clock in the side. We want to be able to give students feedback that is going to be effective. And the most important thing is to make sure that it is timely, so that students can actually do something with it in a given time frame, respond and develop and move on from there. So that is the end of our piece. The QR code just sends you to the slide deck, but as I say, we will give the slide deck to you all afterwards. And what you see on the right-hand side are a couple of snapshots from the Teaching Toolkit on our website and the given page on assessment and feedback that we have. So we are going to finish up, or I'm going to finish up, and Leigh and I will then be available to answer any questions. And just a little punt for our next session, which will be on group teaching on the 16th of November.